Every summer, for the past few years, a group of friends and I have traveled from our homes in Liverpool, in the UK, to Dumfries in Galloway, in Scotland. Dumfries in Galloway is home to the largest, continuous forest in the whole of the United Kingdom, Galloway Forest Park. It's about as wild as it gets for the UK, with some parts of the woods being so dense and overgrown that it's clear no one has stepped foot in them for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. Our yearly visits brought us peace, clarity, and a respect for nature. But last year's trip ended in one of the most horrifying and distressing incidents of my entire life. One that completely changed the way I see the world, and the way I consider the human mind. Year in, year out, we'd take an overnight coach up across the border, then hike out to a place called Loch Aber. The loch is a private fishing lake, supposedly reserved for members of a local fishing club who ensure that the waters are chock full of fish for them to catch, which makes it oh so easy for us to pull a quick, in-and-out raid to catch enough of the smaller rough fish for our dinner. I'm serious, 45 minutes and we're golden, and take it from any fisherman, that is lightning speed for a half-decent catch. But, last year, we decided we were tired of the same old digs and set our gazes further afield. A map told us that there was a similarly deep loch about 30 miles east, known as Loch Dee. We figured it would be a perfect fishing spot, and we were right. Sure, it wasn't as quick-fire as the private members' lake, but it came with considerably less guilt. Everything was going perfect, that was until the second night, when in the middle of a campfire drinking session, one of my buddies jumped out of his seat and recoiled from the fire. "Who the hell is that?" he asked, sort of calmly at first, nothing more than cautious confusion. "Who's who?" someone replies lazily. "Someone moving, through the trees back there." He was pointing into the trees directly behind my back. I actually gave a hoot of sarcastic laughter at first, thinking he was just trying to scare us. But the moment it became obvious that he was not messing around, a jolt of fear went through me and I too leapt out of my seat, spun around, and shined my torch into the darkness. You could feel the tension among us rising as we desperately looked around for who he might have been talking about. Torch beams darted across the trees, inspecting every trunk or thicket of bushes, but there was nothing, no sign of the person my friend had seen. "Hello," someone called out, immediately shushed by the rest of us. No one wanted to give away our position, but at the same time, we needed to know if there was anyone out there, watching us. But again, nothing, just silence. "I think you've had a bit too much to drink, mate," I remember saying to the guy who's supposedly seen a figure walking through the trees. "I'm fine, I've barely touched that bells I brought. I swear to God I saw someone just then." "Like who?" someone asked. "Man, woman, young, old, what?" I don't know," he replied shakily, "but they were big, really big. Only big thing around here is your bloody imagination, mate. Now go and get your head down, it's been a long day." And it had, thanks to the overnight coach. No one really sleeps on the journey up to Scotland. I mean, they close their eyes, put some chill music through their earphones, but they never really sleep. So everyone ends up being pretty wrecked by the end of the first night. The next morning, we felt even worse. The first night after such a long journey is usually one where we sleep like the dead, but not that night. None of us could quite relax, not with the possibility of having someone stalking us in the backs of our minds. Thank God we were only planning to fish that day, as we really were not in the mood for anything else, given how bloody exhausted we were. After breakfast, we marched down to the loch with our fishing gear. It's a gorgeous area, a crisp, blue lake ringed by hills. It's not unusual to get some really nice, sunny days up in Scotland too, especially during the summer. But that day, the sky was this horrible, grimy gray, like the sun had barely risen at all. I was tired, half soaked from the drizzle, barely even excited to be fishing for my dinner. I actually hoped for something exciting to happen, and for my sins, my wish came true. "Look," one of us shouted, "over there, other side of the loch. Jesus Christ, can you see that thing?" It was the same lad that had seen someone, or something, walking through the trees. We were terrified. One sighting could have been his eyes playing tricks on him, another couldn't possibly be a mistake. "There," he said, pointing, "just on the other side. It came out of the trees for a moment then disappeared again. Please tell me you saw that." "Mate, just calm down, it's probably just Ash. I know what I saw. And we need to get the hell out of these bloody woods, right now," he said, grabbing up his fishing gear in a panic. I remember him rushing off back to camp, one of the lads following him, still trying to calm him down. But it was impossible. He was manic, scared half to death by whatever had briefly emerged from the woods on the other side of the loch. I asked the other boys if they'd seen anything. Each shook their head. None of had any idea what he was talking about, but that didn't mean they weren't just as freaked out over his outburst. We were supposed to stay for 7 full nights. But that second one was our last. We'd managed to talk the lad who was panicking down, convince him to stay a few nights more at the very least. We'd come all this way, and I wasn't about to let one of us just leave because they'd had a wee scare or something. But it didn't end there either. In the middle of the night, the lad that had been seeing something burst out of his tent, waking each of us up before asking, "Can you hear that?" There was silence, dead silence. I mean, I strained my ears trying to hear what had him so spooked, but I heard nothing, just the rustling of a few sleeping bags as confused bloke sat up awake. He was scratching at his own ears, gritting his teeth, rocking back and forth in the dirt as the sound seemed to completely overwhelm him. That's the exact moment I realized, I think the same moment everyone else picked up on it too, that there was no noise. There was no monster. It was all in his head. He was experiencing a psychotic break, and it was all in his head. The scariest story I've ever heard was told to me by my grandfather. He was a soldier during the Second World War, enlisting on the day he turned 18 on March 3, RD, 1944. The timing meant he missed the D-Day landings, as well as all the horrors associated with it, but he arrived on the Western Front just in time to take part in something arguably much worse: the invasion of the German homeland. Looking back, with the kind of 20/20 vision that hindsight gives you, it seems obvious that Nazi Germany was destined to lose the war, squeezed under the combined weights of the Allied and Soviet armed forces. But in the moment, during the day-to-day fighting in the fields and forests of Northern Europe, the future seemed anything but certain. In fact, Germany was still convinced it could win the war. Using atomic bomb technology, stubborn defensive tactics, or a combination of the two, the Nazis were far from convinced that their fight was over. And it was into this new phase of the war that my grandfather found himself in, during a nightmarish push into the Nazi heartland that would prove just as terrifying as anything that had preceded it, if not more so. On the 2nd of October, 1944, the Battle of Aachen began. The city had been incorporated into the Siegfried Line, the main defensive network on Germany's western border, and the Allies hoped to capture it quickly before advancing into the industrialized Ruhr Basin to land the knockout blow to German manufacturing capabilities. However, a few miles south of the city lay a place known as Herkenwald, or Hürtgen Forest. It was here that over 80,000 German soldiers were based, and the U.S. Army Task Force sent into the woods intended to pin them down and prevent them from reinforcing the city of Aachen. It's there that my grandfather's story occurs, so without further ado, this is what happened to him. He and his platoon had been tasked with a routine patrol through the woods, probing for the German defensive line on which they could call in artillery and air support. It has been a quiet morning, but that calm was shattered when a distant rifle shot sent one of his platoon mates crashing into the dirt. The soldiers tried to find what little cover they could, but it took a few minutes before they could work out just which angle the shots were coming from. And in that time, 3 or 4 other Americans fell to that German sniper's bullets. A few men tried to tactically withdraw under covering fire from their fellow soldiers, but the sniper picked them off before they could get away. Before long, the entire platoon was pinned down by the sniper, completely unable to move without being shot down where they stood. But as horrendous as that sounds, that's not the part that stuck with him. It's what came next. The platoon's radio man had been the one shot during the initial ambush, and had bled to death pretty quickly, lying lifeless in a slight clearing among the trees. Anytime any of the soldiers tried to pull the man's radio unit to safety, the sniper would let off a shot, ensuring they kept their distance. One brave soul actually managed to get a hand on the radio, but through obscene skill or just plain luck, the sniper managed to put a bullet through the upper section of the palm, basically blowing out his finger ligaments and rendering his hand useless. To their absolute horror, there was no way for any of them to call an artillery or air support. Effectively, more than 20 men were completely at the mercy of one German sniper. My grandfather told me that on numerous occasions, a soldier might shift a little in place, maybe peek up to see if they could spot the sniper's firing position. And each time, the man would fall dead or scream out in pain as a bullet whizzed through the trees and found its mark. And each time the sniper fired, and cut down another American in cold blood, he would laugh. He laughed so loud it would echo through the trees around them. My grandfather said that was a sound that he could never, ever forget, hearing the joy in that German sniper's laugh, the raw, violent delight he felt when his bullets struck home. Sometimes he would shout something, a phrase my grandfather couldn't understand, but had translated later on. Mehr weinen Kinder. More crying children. That sniper had my grandfather's platoon pinned down for about 6 full hours, but to him, it felt like days. They had to just lie there, perfectly still, as the dead, open eyes of their fallen comrades stared at them, looks of shock and horror on their lifeless faces. At one point, the sniper, unable to spy any living targets through his high-powered scope, began to fire upon the dead in an attempt to break the platoon psychologically. My grandfather told me the entire platoon winced in disgust and terror as a bullet smashed into a dead man's skull. He had bled out leaning up against a tree, and was evidently still well within the sniper's sights. Of all the wounds and injuries my grandfather saw during the war, he told me head wounds were always the worst. Once the structural integrity of the human skull is compromised, be it by bullet or shrapnel or from the blunt force of a rifle butt, a person's face changes shape. The first bullet that hit the dead man's skull practically split it in two, right down the middle. But nothing I can write will outdo the exact, horrific manner in which my grandfather described it. I'd known that guy for months, I could recognize him in the dark, just from his gait. But now, I didn't recognize him at all. His eyes, way too far apart, he looked inhuman. But the sniper didn't stop there, he laughed and laughed and laughed as he sent 2 bullets, then 3, then 4, sailing into the dead man's skull, pulverizing it until it was just a mess of broken bone and leaking brain matter. Eyeballs, still connected by the optical nerve, dangled from shattered eye sockets. I can't even imagine how traumatic that must have been for a kid who was only barely 18 years old. I mean, he was still a kid, a goddamn child. I think back to when I was 18, I could barely handle seeing a paper cut, let alone seeing someone's entire goddamn head explode. His platoon had to wait until nightfall to escape. They did so as barks of Feigling. Feigling echoed through the trees. Cowards, cowards, the German sniper called them, in between volleys of that perverted, manic laughter. My grandpa said he still expected to be shot as they ran back the way they came, trying not to have head-on collisions with tree trunks as they did. One man was so terrified he actually did run straight into a tree, broke his nose, but just got up and kept running. Grandpa died last year, so I consider this a little tribute to a great man who went through terrible times. Rest in peace, Grandpa. I beg you, I implore you, please, do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know those woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages. So trust me when I say that something has been changing out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In early spring, birds migrate back from the warmer, southern climates to their northern territories, en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupy the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is, in reality, a bellowed war cry, a call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I couldn't hear a single goddamn thing. No birds, or any other animals for that matter, seemed to still call the forest home. This made me nervous for 2 reasons. 1. Animals have an uncanny ability to detect dangers that are imperceptible to humans. Their sense of smell, hearing and general atmospherics are far superior to our own. If the wildlife had fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. And 2, areas of woodland turn exceptionally quiet when there is a large predator around. Wood pigeons will become deathly quiet and still, hoping a black bear or mountain lion will just pass them by. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So naturally, I started making my way back towards my car, when something real peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at this point that I'd been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. It's pretty far from where our family lived when I was a kid, but thanks to our bikes, we had a pretty large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. Point being, I know those woods really well, but some way, somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I'd managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try and massage away the ache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic running through me. I did not recognize my surroundings. And I cannot understate how jarring that was for me, to be somewhere I'd been visiting all my life, only for it to feel utterly foreign to me. I actually had to take a moment to take out my compass, just to try and get a bearing of where I was headed. But to my surprise, the compass needle kept slowly moving around. Even when I got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it slowly began creeping around again. Now, this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there are ways around a faulty compass. Like, for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight. So that provided an easy way of determining which way was north. At least, it usually would. Because as I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky. That or the moss in this area grew mostly on the south section of the tree trunks. I get that it's not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble up in my chest. But to panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation and death. I kept myself calm, told me there was a rational explanation for everything that was occurring, and walked off in the direction I was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then I came across something I'd never, ever seen in those woods before, something that seemed so out of place that it was frankly terrifying. In all the years I'd spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I'd never seen anything like the old, run-down cabin that stood before me. And I mean it was old, as in there was no way it could have been built any later than like 1979, so just how me and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door, see if anyone was home, and as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer towards the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness, maybe my blood sugar was low, I'm not entirely sure, but for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I was actually bringing a closed fist up to knock on that old wooden door, it felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain, "Leave this place and never return, don't look back, never look back." When I finally knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks that were on the door had long since been worn away, and the inside was just as run down and rotten as the outside was. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order to the furniture that led me to believe that, every so often, the cabin did actually receive some visitors, aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. What I'm about to attempt to describe is, quite frankly, indescribable. I know it was a wooden idol of some kind, a small statuette sat atop of a stone altar. But, and I appreciate this is intensely confusing to read, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned again, along with a kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. Don't ask me how I know, but that wooden idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil. And I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that I ran like a scared child from that cabin. And into the night. The night. You read that right. When I walked into that cabin, it was still daylight. I couldn't have been there for more than a couple of minutes, at least, that's what it felt like. Only when I burst through that wooden door, it was pitched black outside. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and drove like a madman until I was safely back at home. I haven't been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day, until now. I tried to tell a hunting buddy of mine once, but the words just wouldn't seem to come out. But please, if you're reading this, heed my warning. And do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts.